And today's guest is here to talk about classical Chinese poetry. And to do that, I'm handing over now to RFI's Jan van der Made.
Thank you, Angela. Today in the studio we have our guest, Ambassador Nicolas Chappuit, who is a translator of a massive body of Tang poetry. He translated over 200 poems of the Chinese poet Tu Fu, Tang Dynasty, who in total wrote a couple of thousand poems, of which about 1,500 are left. Tu Fu is the 8th century height of the Tang Dynasty, as famous as Shakespeare, and at least in China, as influential on poetry and literature. The reason you are here today is the publication by Les Belles Lettres of the second part of your translation of Tu Fu's poems, titled Tu Fu, La Guerre Civile, the Civil War, 755 to 759, poetical works. You just told me that this is the second part of 12 works. I thought there were only 3 of them. So you still have quite a lot of work to do.
Yes, another 10, 12 years to go.
Now, before we go to Tu Fu himself, I would like to ask you a bit about the poetry, the difficulties, the art of translation of Chinese poetry. First of all, how did you get into Chinese classical poetry in the first place?
By interest for Chinese culture. Once you have mastered modern Chinese and contemporary Chinese history, you find yourself with the idea that if you do not go into the culture, into the depth of a culture, there are many things you will never understand. The Chinese today still have in their expressions, in their proverbs, in their way to tell stories, a lot to do with what classical China did. There's a continuity. And so that's why I decided to go further into my own studies and to look at classical China. And if you look at classical China, you have to go to the Tang Dynasty, because that was the apex of the Chinese culture in the 8th century. At the time, China was the first world power. Its capital, today's Xi'an, yesterday's Chang'an, had 1 million people. It was an extraordinary times. And the culture, the architecture, the painting were all fantastic, and you still have traces of it today, of course. And the most important poet of the time is Tu Fu.
But before we go to him, about the language, the language which is spoken today, the vernacular language, it's completely different from the language which was used at that time, right?
Of course.
It was much more concise at the moment in the Tang Dynasty.
It's even further than what English is with Old English, or French with Old French. It is a very different language. It was pronunciated very different than modern Chinese is today in Mandarin. People have tried to reconstruct Middle Chinese, and they think that it must have sounded like today's Cantonese or some of the Japanese way of reading Chinese characters.
Also, one big difference between Chinese and other languages is that it's a tonal language, which means that tones signify a certain meaning, certain different meaning from if you pronounce one character, for instance, ma, and you pronounce it ma, it means something else. Could you to illustrate how this is in poetry, could you read like 2 sentences from one of
From a Tu Fu poem, one of his most known, and it goes this way. 国破山河在，城春草木深。干湿花间泪，恨别无尽兴。
So it's kind of going up and down,
yes,
singing.
And especially in poetry, because Chinese poems are regulated not only by rhymes, but by tones.
So how do you translate this? It's impossible to express this in a language which does not have this tonal significance of words.
Yes, and it is one of the major difficulties to render it into any Western language, of course. You lose the music, inevitably, but you can replace it with something like Umberto Eco used to say, which is almost the music or almost the sense. And you have to get as close as you can to that musicality of the Chinese text and its meaning. It is difficult, and that's why so few of his poems have been translated up to today, because the renderings, sometimes the renditions of Chinese poetry could be very dull if you do not achieve that sense of musicality.
Now, even apart from the tonal difficulties, if you just look at the characters you see in most of the poems, they consist of sentences having 5 characters each. Now, I have seen a poem which is not yet translated in your compilation called 4 Characters Traveling at Night. Then I found some translations. Stephen Owen translates it with writes of what he feels traveling by night. Witter Binner says A Night Abroad. Tony Barnstone translates it with Thoughts While Night Traveling. A.S. Klein, Night Journey Thoughts. Cyril Birch, Thoughts on a Night Journey. How do you decide how you translate a certain character? Is it a mood, or how do you decide it?
Well, it's true for any translation from any language. You have to make choices. And what you do is, for a poem, the title has always a great meaning. It's not there by coincidence. And you look in the poem itself, why the poet chose that title. And that's how you end up making the choice in your mother language. But of course, there could be variants, there could be many different ways, but successful ways are very rare.
Well, you yourself, if you translate the Chinese poetry of Tu Fu, do you prefer to stick as close as possible to the Chinese original, or do you like to make it more understandable for the reader, because sometimes it's very esoteric and hard to understand?
You try to do both, of course. It will be a crime, in my view, in my opinion, to ignore what the poet wanted to say. But you need to put it in words that are amenable to the French reader, in my case. So it is a balance, a very delicate one that you have to achieve, line by line, verse by verse. And with Du Fu, you manage, through the body of work, to identify yourself with the poet at one time. It's like, Victor Hugo in French, or Shakespeare, as you mentioned in the English tradition. Once you are inside the text, then you begin to think like he did. And Du Fu is one of these poets. He has a world of language. He has his habits of playing with words. Sometimes he makes puns. He always tried to strike the reader. And at the time, poems were sung, by the way. And so he's trying to attract the attention of the person he's reading to. And that's how you manage to work with a text.
Let's now go to Tu Fu and his times. He was a Mandarin at the court of the Emperor. Xuanzong was his name. When he was at the court, there was this famous rebellion, a massive rebellion, causing thousands and thousands of deaths, the Anlushan rebellion. So Tu Fu personally witnessed the world changing from what was, as you already said, the most prosperous time in Chinese history, the Tang Dynasty, culturally flourishing periods, into complete chaos. There was misery, there was warfare, suffering. How was that reflected in his poetry?
Well, the Chinese say that Du Fu is both a poet and an historian, because his poetry is the witness to that apocalypse of the Chinese world as they knew it at the time. These Turks who toppled the Tang emperor did not have any respect for Chinese culture, as Du Fu was raised to uphold. And because of that, he managed to give voice to the suffering of his times, and especially to the young soldiers who were enrolled in the army, to the peasants who couldn't harvest their fields. He was the first one to document a tragic period of history.
Now, to Tu Fu today, in the preface of your book, you say that there was a massive compilation which came out in 2014 of all Tu Fu's works. It started in 1978. 36 years it took the compiler and his team to compile it. What is the influence today, briefly, of Tu Fu on the Chinese audience?
Well, he's considered as the sage of poetry, someone that is that every child should learn by rote in order to be a real Chinese citizen.